And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Rural Call Completion, How to Avoid Seven-Figure Hits to Your Bottom Line. Presenting today are three close friends and industry veterans, and we're glad to have them with us. We have Andy Rajitsky. Andy, welcome.
Thank you.
We have Ken Babcock and Ryan Guthrie of ATS. ATS is a revenue assurance company. You'll hear more about them later on. Before we start the presentation, Andy will be the first speaker. He'll be followed by Ken and then Ryan, and we'll, if things go the way we planned them, we'll have about 10 minutes or so at the conclusion of their presentations for a question and answer session. Just so you know, during the webinar itself, everyone will be in listen-only mode, but if you do have questions, feel free to enter them into the question box you'll see on your screen. We'll go through those as they come in, organize them, and try to get to as many of them as we possibly can in the time that we have available to us. One other thing, there'll be a brief survey at the conclusion of the webinar, so then when we do exit, just stay on the line for just a second. It's a very brief one, maybe 5 or 6 questions, but it's helpful to us in terms of the quality of the webinar and also in topics that we choose for future webinars. There's a wealth of material to be covered here today. Don't worry about writing lots of notes. You'll be able to get a copy of the slides and a copy of the audio portion of the webinar. You'll see that via an email that we'll send out before the end of the week that will allow you to download those materials. You can use them for reference. We encourage you to do that. We also encourage you to share them with your colleagues. With that, I'm going to be quiet on my end for now, and I'll be back for the question and answer session. And to start us off, I'm going to ask Andy Rajitsky to pick up the baton. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, George, and welcome everybody. Appreciate you all taking time to be in on this. And I'm sure, like me, you spend just about every weekend perusing the FCC website for fun. And this past weekend, I was kind of looking at it to see what the FCC had done about the particular issue of rural call completion. And I was kind of amazed because this is an issue that's kind of under the radar when you look at all the other things the FCC's involved with. But there are 3 points I want to start out with to introduce this topic. And number one is the FCC takes this subject deathly seriously. There, since March of 2013, there have been 4 companies that have had to agree to consent decrees and pay a ton of money for poor rural call completion records. And the very last one took place this past January, where a particular company had to pay a fine of $5 million. So the first point I want you to get out of my section is this is a serious issue and it ought to be taken seriously. Second major point I want to get across is there's a reason that there's a particular issue in completing calls to rural areas. We'll talk about some of the specifics in a minute, but the point is that it costs more for calls to be completed to a rural ILEC that takes place in a situation where that ILEC is regulated under rate of return. That's where you're going to see this problem. And the third thing I want to make is even though access rates are coming down, which should help this problem somewhat, the problem is not going to go away by itself just due to reductions in access charges. It's going to continue for the indefinite future. Theoretically, down the line in an all IP world, we might not have this issue, but until then, it's going to be a significant issue. And so what is the problem? Looking at that very first slide, obviously it's completing calls to rural areas, and there's a lot of different manifestations of this, periods of dead air, audible ringing tones, etc. You can see the slide for yourself, but these are all kind of lumped together under the issue of having problems completing rural calls. And we're talking about rural long distance calls specifically. And the FCC takes it very seriously because there's things like life and death involved for 911 calls in rural areas. They also take it seriously because it involves small local phone companies. And from the beginning of the FCC, they have cared very deeply about phone companies that serve very rural areas and making sure those phone companies are protected. And so this is an issue that the FCC is going to stay with and going to stick with for the next few years at least. Let's move on. Now, what are the particular causes of it? Well, like I said, it costs more to complete calls to rural areas. That's because when a call is made to a rural area and the IXC, the long distance provider, turns the call over to the ILEC at the ILEC tandem, there could be a tremendous distance involved to reach the individual end offices involved. And so for transport of these calls, the IXC is going to pay both a tandem switch charge, a direct transport charge. You can't avoid those charges. You do not have enough traffic to bill directly to each individual end office in a rural area. And so you have great lengths and you have big transport charges. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. There are other causes of this. There are some technical causes that involve with how the calls are set up, signaling causes. But the main thing is, because of the higher costs, IXCs will try to find ways around paying the higher access charges. And they'll do so by usually hiring an intermediate carrier like a least call router. And some least cost routers are legit, but some apparently provide less than adequate service, which is one of the main problems that the FCC identifies for rural call completion issues. Let's move on. The FCC became aware of this particular issue in 2011 when a whole bunch of rural ILECs brought this issue to the FCC's attention. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And the FCC has taken a variety of actions to try to do something about it. They've issued a couple of declaratory rulings. They've started a task force. They've held workshops. They've come up with a whole variety of things, but nothing up until this point has really solved the problem. One of the biggest things they did a couple of years ago was ICC reform, and let's move to the next slide. And that will reduce for rate of return ILECs, the small ILECs generally governed by NECA, it will reduce their end office charges. And I have the schedule over the next couple of slides, but you'll note that the transport charges will simply go on. They are capped right now at interstate rates, but there's nothing in the access charge reductions that are ordered by the FCC that will reduce transport charges for rate of return ILECs any lower than they are now. And also this weekend, since I had so much time on my hands, I went back and I went to the NECA tariff, which is always fun, and I added up some of the charges for tandem switch transport. And if you look just at tandem switching alone, along with facility and termination mileage charges, you find that alone transport is almost a penny a minute just for that piece of transport, and that doesn't count the direct trunks one has to buy. So the point is, there ain't no way that an IXC can escape paying more money. So you're just going to have to, number one, bite the bullet, and number two, find a way, if you're involved with completing rural calls, to ensure that your record is significantly well enough or good enough that the FCC is not going to get involved. Let's move on. Okay, this is a schedule that I have over the next 2 pages that talks about how rates are coming down to bill and keep, but they don't come down to bill and keep, at least right now, for transport charges for rate of return carriers. So let's move on. Keep going. Okay, in that particular access charge order, the FCC took action to try to solve one of the particular issues with completing calls, and that's the issue of phantom traffic. And that was a situation where traffic was going out to the terminating end and it could not be identified. And the FCC took specific action to require carriers to stop removing identification and to provide enough info so the call can be billed correctly. one of the things carriers did with phantom calling was that if you couldn't identify what the traffic was, the IXC could make the argument, sometimes a legitimate way, that traffic should be billed at an interstate rate instead of an intrastate rate, which was much more expensive. The access reform plus the changes to phantom traffic, or the measures the FCC has taken, has seemed to reduce that problem pretty significantly. But all in all, there was still a problem going into the end of 2013 when the FCC decided to issue the call completion order, which will be the basis of the rest of this call. So let's move to the next slide, please. And that order came out in November of 2013, but did not really take effect until this past April. And that's because there were some issues with the Office of Budget Management to get it approved, but it was also because the FCC knew that there's a whole lot of data involved. And so they kind of held off as much as they could, hoping the problem would go away by itself. But clearly it will not. And so in this particular order, the FCC is now requiring quarterly reports for what it calls covered carriers, which are basically long-distance carriers that make long-distance calls from more than 100,000 domestic retail subscriber lines. And the next couple of speakers will talk about the details of this, but it's important to note that there are a lot of carriers covered by this, and there are a lot of data that has to be, there's a lot of data that has to be filed. If you move on to the next slide. If you look at the bottom of this, here's a list of some of the things that covered providers, these IXCs, have to file on a quarterly basis. And moving one more slide, the other important thing to note about this is that there is no sunset, even though carriers argued that with access reform, this is not going to become a significant issue over time. The FCC disagreed and has not put a single end date on this, so it's going to continue into the indefinite future. We know in a couple of years the FCC is going to look at the reports that have been filed to see where things stand on the particular issue. And then in 3 years, it's going to hold a review to determine whether or not any kind of data requirements have to be reformed or even ended. But that's down the road, and that's unlikely due to the fact that it's always going to be more expensive in the TDM network to complete calls to these rural providers. So that's it. We've got a significant issue on our hands. There's a lot of money involved if you don't do up to the standards of what the FCC is requiring. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ken, and these folks are going to tell you how that you can adapt to this FCC order and try to save yourself some money. So Ken?
Hi, this is Ken Babcock. Thanks, Andy. My particular section, it does focus on data and the processing of that data in the form of the reporting that's required. And the first slide really tries to draw attention to the fact that the FCC was put in a position of wanting to be very specific as far as what is an answered versus an unanswered call. And if you look at the declaratory ruling that was put out in February of this year, you could very easily pick up on what they see as being required. There are two basic reports that are necessary in putting together the report, and I've referred to them as both answered and percent calls answered, percent calls completed report. The difference being the percent calls answered report looks at just that. It takes the total number of answered calls and divides it by the total number of attempts less unassigned numbers that end up as attempts, and it comes up with a percent answered. And this percent is going to be probably a little bit lower. You would think that would be the case at least than percent calls completed, in that that's the second part of the report where the report is getting at, actually gives the service providers credit for busy lines or calls that are recorded as attempts that failed due to busy lines on the terminating end, or ring no answer type conditions. So percent calls answered looks just at what is the total answered percent, whereas percent completed does give, in essence, credit for the fact that some of the attempts are going to fail due to reasons that are not attributable to anyone on the service originator side. So calls that fail because of busy lines or ring no answer are not, in essence, being held as a negative in the percent calls completed. The report is designed to get at rural ILECS and non-rural ILECS, and NECA has been given the role during the fourth quarter of the year. They're supposed to put out lists of ILECS that would be classified as rural, and those that wouldn't fall into that category are shown as non-rural. And obviously there are a number of carriers that would fall into both categories. The focus for the data is intra-LATA type long distance, things that are intra-LATA in nature and not part of the measurement. The attempt is to be looking at inter-LATA traffic, and it's done separately for interstate, separately for intrastate, and then the aggregate total of both. All right, moving on to the next slide. The data retention requirements are fairly specific in terms of the data has to be available for audit up to 6 months after the submission of the report. And it's recommended, obviously, that, well, it may not be obvious, but all of the calls from which the report is drawn, that universe of calls, should be retained, not just the ones that end up being identified as rural ILECS or non-rural ILECS. Moving on to the next slide, there are a number of data exclusions. Any call that lasts, any attempt that is 2 seconds or less than 2 seconds rather, it is not to be subject to the report, and any calls that are terminated to toll-free services, the 8XX services or SAC codes as I would call them, and calls terminated to CMRS or wireless services, those that would terminate to CLECs, and calls terminated to VoIP service providers, if there's a way of knowing that. All of those calls would be excluded from the report. Moving on to the next slide, the unanswered type traffic is very, as I said, very specific in terms of the instructions that have been made available. There are even attachments, appendices that are offering examples that actually quote SS7 cause values or SIP response messages. However, the order doesn't require that you have to do the reports from the signaling data itself. To the extent that you have long distance toll CDR records that are very granular in terms of answer types, that will suffice. And that's something that has to be explained as part of the report, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in one fashion or another, you obviously need to be able to record all attempts of this category, of this type, and be able to create subcategories of attempts that show the number of attempts due to unassigned numbers, unassigned terminating numbers, cases where there's ring no answer or terminating number is busy. And of course, whatever's left is the big part of the equation in terms of the 400-pound gorilla, other. Moving on to the report itself, the report is, Sam, you could move on. The first report that's due is due for the second quarter of 2015, and it will cover starting April 1st, 2015 through June 30th, 2015. There'll be separate months, separate reports by calendar month. They have to be filed by service provider, by calendar month, by state, and break out non-rural calls by actually right down to the terminating operating company number, OCN value. And the non-rural information can be aggregated in total for non-rural without the breakouts. There's also a provision should voluntary, to the extent that auto dialer traffic or robocalling type traffic is part of what you're experiencing, then it's possible that you could separately report this information on a voluntary basis. But it's expected that the reports themselves will contain auto dialer traffic should there be a way of identifying that in the particular service provider's territory. All right, moving on, the report itself has to be filed online. The FCC has put out a Form 480 for rural call completion reporting, and it's very specific in terms of what it requires. The person preparing the report, or organization preparing the report, has to file, and if they don't have one already, have to have a FCC registration number. And the process itself is very structured. They provide, the FCC report is available in template form, and it shows all of the non-rural ILEC OCNs that are there by state, and the fact that you must report for every row, even where you don't have data, showing 0 attempts where applicable. There is a very good filing interface user guide that's available on the website, and definitely would recommend taking a look at that at the earliest time, in that it's very helpful in looking at it. And you'll see that as far as filing the report itself, it not only is being done online, but there are explanations required to identify how you're classifying a call as answered, busy, ring no answer, unassigned number, and so forth, as defined in the declaratory ruling that we talked about early on. And to the extent that auto dialer calling is being separately reported, there's a requirement to explain how you're able to identify auto dialer calls. But as I said, the report process is very detailed, very structured, and it's something that will take, I'm sure, getting used to for anybody that attempts to do it online. One of the things that I would mention to you is that in the back there are some links that enable you to get to websites and so forth. I found that in a couple of cases the links were not totally accurate, so be a little bit conscious of that. There is information available as they suggest, and the link that I saw that wasn't correct was off by just a little bit, but I'm sure you can wade through that. That, in a very quick fashion, is what's required in terms of the reporting process itself. A lot of data to be crunched to the extent that you can identify and separately get at toll switch type recordings. It'll make the process significantly easier, but it doesn't reduce the amount of crunching that's required. One of the things that I did see in working with one customer was that probably only about 25% of their toll traffic that was being recorded at their toll switch was actually subject to report. Much of the traffic they had terminated to the areas that I had mentioned were excluded, as far as calls terminated to toll-free services, wireless providers, CLECs, and so forth. So that's something to be aware of, that you'll spend a lot of time winnowing out information that must be reported, but all of that needs to be retained for a period of 6 months, and it is auditable. So I think that's it. I think I'm ready to turn it over to Ryan.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so as Ken mentioned, there's a 6-month data retention requirement for the rural call completion, and the thing I want to talk about a little bit now is the big data aspect of that, and is the burden of storing that data really a blessing in disguise? So what you really can ask yourself is, all right, now that I have to store this data anyway for 6 months for roll call completion, what else can I be doing with it? Other regulatory things, Universal Service Fund, traffic studies, or subpoena support, marketing efforts, revenue assurance, all different applications that you might be able to use that data for. So now that you have to store it for 6 months, you probably ask yourself, how much data does that really add up to? So 100,000 lines is the minimum for the roll call completion. If you're over 100,000 lines, it means you have to file. And if you have around 100,000 lines, my guess is you generate around 100 gig of data over those 6 months. And if you store the data for what we really recommend you do is up to 5 or 7 years. 6 months for roll call completion, 5 or 7 years is sort of good practice and compliance. That quickly adds up to over a terabyte. And again, you could say, well, I could probably buy an external hard drive at Best Buy for $100 and throw it under my desk and put it on the shelf, and I'm all set. And believe it or not, some of the customers who we go into and start working with, and we say, where's your backup data? They say, oh, it's on my shelf on that terabyte drive. For a lot of reasons, you can probably imagine that's not the best place for it. It's not very secure. It's not very accessible for other purposes. It's not redundant. There's a whole litany of reasons why you probably shouldn't be doing that. So the first recommendation we always have going in is to move the data off those hard drives, or if it's in a server in the back room, wherever it might be, and move it up to some type of cloud storage. It's much less expensive than you'd probably guess. My guess is to store the data for a month, depending on the size of your company, of course, that it will cost you less than you probably spent on coffee this week. So it's really not that expensive. It's very secure, probably more secure than the way you're storing it today, and again, redundant. So really moving from local storage like a external hard drive to the cloud is a low-cost move with a lot of high-end potential that we'll get into. Moving on. So before we get going into the details, let's start dispelling some of these big data myths. So these are ones that we hear often at different trade shows and conversations we have with customers. So a lot of people say it's probably too expensive for me. And like we were just talking about, depending on your size, if you're on the smaller end, you have 100,000, 200,000 lines, it probably costs you around $10 a month just to store the data. Again, just as cheap as it would be for that external hard drive, but you can do a whole lot more with it once you're storing it. Some people say, well, we don't have the expertise to do anything with big data. And you don't need to be a big data expert to get started. That's the beauty of a lot of these services like Amazon and Google and Rackspace. They are the experts, and they provide a whole lot of documentation information on how to get started. It's really, you can be a beginner and get started quickly. And of course, there's a lot of third-party vendors that can get you going quickly, like ourselves. So you can get started without having the expertise in-house. Probably the biggest concern we hear from customers or potential customers is that the data is not secure. Could it be hacked? Could it be is it open to the public? And security is a major concern for these cloud providers. They know that it's a major concern for everyone else, and they have entire staffs that's their only function is security. Some companies probably have a small staff or maybe even no staff to full-time security. It might be somebody's second job or third job. These companies have whole groups that only do security. The data is encrypted on the way to the cloud, and you can optionally encrypt it in the cloud as well. So it's very secure. There's big companies that use cloud services like Netflix and Comcast, even some federal agencies like the CIA and FBI and NASA. And I know some of you might be thinking I don't necessarily trust the CIA and FBI either, but they trust that the data there is secure. So I would say if they can trust it, I think we can trust it. Some companies on the smaller end might say we're not really big enough for big data. We don't really need to do it. But as we were starting to talk about there, that data really adds up. You start with 6 months. You start going up to storing it for 5, 7 years. Things add up quickly. And once the data is stored there, there's, again, all these other possibilities of what you can do with it. And we'll get into a little bit of that today. The last myth, it makes insights easy. That's probably an odd thing to see on the screen there. You're probably not sure what it means. A lot of people think that if you throw data up into the cloud, all of a sudden all these great insights come pouring out of it. And that's really not the case. Throwing it up into the cloud is just the beginning. Once it's up there, there's a lot of big data tools that will help you crunch those volumes. But the insights you really get out of it are small enough that would fit on your PC or an Excel spreadsheet, or something really manageable. All the big nuggets of insights we've gotten out of data are small like that. It's not just throwing it up there and all of a sudden insights start pouring out at you. Moving on from there. So the idea that we try to promote is the store once, use many. So once the data is stored up into the cloud, you can use it for a lot of different purposes and also a lot of different groups. So if regulatory needs to store it for rural call completion, marketing might be interested, the IT group, revenue assurance, and you can share those benefits and also maybe share the cost of it. So if just one group is trying to do it, but maybe they don't have the resources or the funding to do it, if a couple people get on board, it might be a little easier to make happen. So if you start on the left side of the picture there, that's really your network, so your switches, and they're cranking out CDRs every minute, every day, every hour. And so rather than putting it onto a drive or a server in the back, we recommend putting it up into a cloud environment. When there's a lot of different companies that do that, like Google, the big probably three are here: Google, Amazon, and Rackspace. Amazon is and Google who we use mostly. And the data gets stored there, and then there's all types of different tools that they offer to crunch through that data. And a lot of those tools use Hadoop. If you're not familiar with Hadoop, it was something that Google came up with years ago to really crunch through large volumes of data. And it's parallel processing across commodity hardware to basically share the workloads. So rather than buying one big hunking, $20,000 server with X amount of memory and processors, you can buy 20 $1,000 servers, spend the same amount, and probably have 4 to 5 times the amount of processing power. And the way that works is that it shares the workload across the different processors and different servers, and it's very scalable. If you have a small job, you only use a few. If you need a big job, you can use a lot. The best way to probably explain Hadoop is to, and I've used this often, but is using a deck of cards. So if I handed one of you a deck of cards and I said, flip through this and find me all the kings. You'd go through top to bottom, you'd flip through it, kind of like a computer would process through data top to bottom. When you found a king, you'd hand it to me and say, here you go. And you do it pretty quickly. But if I said, okay, now take 5 of your friends, split that deck up into 5 piles, and each of you go through that data, and when you find the king, hand it back to me. You do it a lot faster. And that's really the way Hadoop works. It says rather than taking one computer to do all this, let's spread the job out, and you can crunch the data a lot faster that way. And when you use these cloud services, it's very scalable, so it's sort of pay-as-you-go processing. If you have a job that you need back very quickly, you can assign more servers to process that job and get it back in a few minutes. If you say it's something I can kick off at midnight, work overnight, and when I get in the morning, it's fine to see it, you can choose less servers to work on it. And the cost goes according to how many you assign to it. So it's very flexible that way. And then to the right side of the picture, you can see all the different applications for it. So the one we're talking about today, obviously, is rural call completion, but you can use it for subpoena support, KPI dashboards, revenue assurance, executive dashboards. The possibilities really become endless once you have that data stored there. And you can do it without stepping on each other. So if you had one server in the back that all that data was on and everybody wanted access at the same time, each person's job might get slowed down because of it. But if you have it up in the cloud and a lot of different tools working on it, nobody sees that lag time, that latency in working on the data. Moving on. Share the wealth. So once the data is up there, again, you can share with a lot of different groups. IT might be struggling to create their own data warehouse for its own purposes. They might not be able to get approval, but you join together and you might be able to make it happen. Marketing might be looking to better understand usage, customer behavior. Once you have those CDRs up into a place where you can analyze it, you can start to look at things like social network analytics. And I don't mean Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, things like that. Social network analytics is how your customers interact with each other. So understanding who talks to who, how often they talk to each other, who that customer belongs to, is there a churn prevention opportunity, upselling, things like that. Engineering might be looking for a better way to monitor the network. Once you have that data stored and you can access it quickly, you can build these KPI dashboards with near real-time analytics and find problems before they show up at the end of the month. And you see a hit in revenue. You can identify it, alarm it, and action it faster when you can get to that data faster. And finally, things like subpoena compliance, where you can query that data and somebody can do it faster, avoid any fines for delays, and really just saving time and cost on fulfilling those subpoena requests. So without getting too into the details, again, one of those big data companies is Amazon. It's one that we use a lot, so I have that in an example here. But so what's the temperature of your data? And on the top there, you see Kinesis and Dynamo. These are all the different types of analysis tools that you can access through Amazon, and each one has its own purpose. So if you look at the picture here, if you look down to the right, you see Amazon Glacier. That's something where you might store your 5 years of data. You don't need to access it too often, but it's a large amount of data. But you put it off into Glacier because you know you won't need to get it often, and the cost goes down. So they store it a little bit cheaper because they know you're not going to need to get at it too much. On the left side, on the hot end, you see that network monitoring. So maybe you only want to store a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe even a couple days worth of data that you want to access quickly. You know, a lot of requests, low latency times, low volume. You pay a little more for that, but you know, another way of analyzing the data. And in the middle there, you have the roll call completion and subpoena request. So they fall probably somewhere in the middle. Roll call completion, you have to store it for 6 months, but you only have to report it quarterly. Subpoena requests, depending how often those come in. You know, basically the idea is these services offer tools that fit no matter what your needs are. And finally, why it's time to think big. Faster, cheaper, better. It's better than that external hard drive sitting on your shelf. You can do it for cheaper than a cup of coffee a week, and there's a lot bigger possibilities of what you can do once that data is stored there. It's very secure, highly redundant. These companies, your data is redundant across fault lines, geographic regions. If there's a earthquake somewhere, your data is not going to be lost. They have it stored everywhere. If a hard drive goes down, you don't have to worry about it. And Netflix, NSA, everybody's using it. And like we were talking about previously, there's a lot of different technologies available, and they're adding to it all the time. So those services we talked about in the previous slide, they're always coming up with new ones that process it a little bit differently and maybe cost a little different. But I really, we believe it's the way of the future of processing data. And there's a lot of solutions that are built for the cloud. So a lot of third-party vendors, including ourselves, we have our solutions built to access and process data from the cloud. So if we go into a company and the data is on those hard drives or it's on a server in the back, the first step is always moving that data up to a cloud environment. And that takes time and cost. And if we went to somebody and they said, hey, our data is already in a bucket, here's the key, go ahead and access it, it would reduce the amount of time for us to implement the tool and ultimately reduce the cost for us to implement it. So it's better for both sides. And you can reduce the cost of failure. And what that means is you can test theories out without incurring a lot of cost. So if you have a hunch or a crazy theory or something you'd like to explore and you don't want to assign somebody to it for a week because you don't think it might pan out, you can run a query in the cloud and crunch the data much faster and figure out whether it really was just a crazy theory or whether it makes sense and it's something you want to implement. And having the data up there reduces the cost to test those theories. So really to sum everything up, the data retention requirement might be a blessing in disguise. You have to store it for 6 months, but storing in a secure cloud environment, you can start to explore all the different possibilities of what else you can do with it, share the costs and the benefits of the different groups, and also make something happen. And that's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Ken. Thank you, Andy. Interesting stuff and a lot of information to be gathered. We've got a couple of questions here, so let me start. This is just a general question, so either of you or any of you feel free to just chime in. But is there a sense of what the FCC is looking for in terms of call completion percentages? I mean, if you collect the data and you look at it, I mean, are you in trouble if it's 97% and not 98%, or is there any sense, or is there anything in what the FCC has done so far to give any indication of expected performance?
This is Ken Babcock. I'm not sure that there's any expectations in terms of performance ranges, but I would be surprised if the expectations don't turn out to be in the high 90% percentile ranges. And I happen to be working with a client that had some very serious situations with folks that were performing the call routing and termination functions, and their percentages were less than 80%. And I know they're in big trouble, and they're working very diligently at this point to try to turn that around. And I don't know, like I said, what if there's any industry expectations, but I would be surprised if the expectation would be less than 90%.
Okay. Ryan, Andy, anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, the FCC didn't give a specific number, but they spent considerable time in their order talking about how this is a life and death situation for a lot of rural consumers. And so, you know, I think that anything, you know, less than 95%, the FCC is going to have concerns with.
Okay. All right. So when our listeners start to compile the data and start reporting, if they're somewhere south of the mid-90s, they probably should have some level of concern at least.
Yeah, they should definitely have some reasons and programs in place as to what the path forward is to bring it up even higher. And like I said, I worked with a customer that had some very serious issues and should have been aware of them well before this report, but there were other priorities and wasn't terribly visible. So the sooner that people look at this and get to where the percentages are, the better off they're going to be. And certainly the difference between rural and non-rural is going to be a very important part of this, to the extent that non-rural call completion percentages are extremely high and the rural ones are not. It's just going to make the situation worse.
One other point, when you look at the consent decrees that the companies who had low rates had to agree to, they all had a game plan for how they were going to improve their call completion. So I would also suggest that if you're low, that number one, obviously you try to figure out the cause and improve it, but you also be able to present to the FCC some type of plan for how you're working to improve things.
Correct.
Good. Good suggestion, Andy. Here's our next question. Does the FCC mandate specify that the report should only include outbound LD termination to rural OCNs? Is there any harm in over-reporting, for example, including local outbound and inbound metrics? Probably for you, Ken.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the template that the FCC is providing, they're very specific in terms of which OCNs that they're looking for information for, and to the extent that it's not one of the rural ILECS that they've specified by state, and it doesn't fall into the category of non-rural, there is no easy way. There is no way to actually report that information for OCNs other than the ones that they're interested in. Other than, like I say, the non-rural large ILECS would be aggregated together, but there's no ability to show traffic being terminated to wireless carriers or CLECs or VoIP providers or whomever. So it's while it would be good to be able to do that, I think maybe that kind of information would be, especially if there's a need to have a program to improve, it might be good to be able to show maybe a wider breadth than what they're asking for. But the report is very focused, and you'll see that in the template that's on the website.
Okay, so even if you wanted to do it the way that the reporting is structured and the template is organized, you really can't do it.
I don't see that there would be an ability to do that.
Okay, thank you. Ryan, here's one. Well, you can start with this, I think, but in one of your slides you had a listing of the 5 or 6 of the major switch vendors. Are any of the switch vendors offering any programs to help with this, or are any of them out in front on this, or are they just, you know, here's the CDRs, you figure it out?
Well, that's a good question, but I'd probably actually defer that over to Ken. There are some, depending on what type of records that get cut, if you have the older Nortel, the DMS 100s that have the BAF-AMA format, there are some modules that you can turn on that a lot of people don't have turned on, so that actually provide some of that information that's required in the report. Some of the newer, soft switch VoIP switches provide a lot more fields that we weren't as concerned about condensing the format. So generally what we've seen is that if you have a soft switch, a VoIP switch, the data that you need for the report is actually in there. If you generate BAF-AMA, it might not be in there, and it might be something you have to turn on. And Ken could probably talk to one of the customers we're working with recently found out that they were not recording enough data in their BAF-AMA and needed to turn these modules on.
Yeah, a lot of them information that probably you'd want to have at your fingertips as part of some feature package that has a price tag attached to it. And one of the customers that I worked with had to go back to the switch vendor and look for retrofit type software that would make it possible to get granularity and answer type. To the extent that you're using signaling switch information, whether it be SS7 or SIP, and most of the granularity that you'd be looking for and actually is being highlighted in the FCC filing would be available. It's only those cases where you didn't have that kind of information available that you'd be stretching to try to see if the switch vendor that's supporting you has the granularity available, and if it's any in the feature packages that you've already bought or could buy at a reasonable price. In all of this, people obviously can measure attempts versus completions and can define how they come up with that. But trying to get unanswered calls down to the level of this call didn't complete because it was ring no answer versus other it's going to be a bit of a stretch for some people, and that's obviously a very first thing to be going after, is to make sure that the call detail records that you intend to use have the granularity that's required.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ken. Here's a question I think it's probably on everyone's mind. Somebody asked it, though. Does anyone have any insight into how the FCC is actually reviewing all of the data submitted? I would think it would be an almost overwhelming task. So, either any of the three of you have any insights into that or thoughts on it?
Well, I don't think it's going to be as daunting as people think. To the extent that you look at this template and see how it's laid out, coming up with an aggregated report above the level of service provider is not going to be all that difficult. I say that, it's easier said than done perhaps, but this is all very, like I said, in a very restricted, very structured type environment that should lend itself to data processing and pop-ups where they can identify by ranges what the information looks like at whatever level they want to drill down to. So I don't think it's going to be as daunting for the FCC as maybe some of the things that have occurred in the past.
Okay. Andy or Ryan, anything to add to that?
Well, I think that the FCC is hearing it from certain ILECS about issues they're having in getting calls completed. And so I think that the FCC has a pretty good idea of some of the companies that they need to be looking at already. And so, I think they're going to use that to help them narrow down and certainly zoom in on the companies that they think they really need to look at very closely.
Okay. All right. Here's another question. We have calls destined for rural EXCLUSIONS that traverse local trunks and LD trunks depending on the calling area. Does the FCC only want the LD terminated call metrics?
My response to that would be yes. They just want the long distance traffic that is interlata in nature, separately broken out by interstate versus intrastate.
Okay. Next question. This person submitting this question is an LCR, least cost routing provider. It says, as an LCR provider of LD services, if I have small telco customers with less than 1,000 subs, but I do not have subs of my own, do I need to complete the roll call completion reports?
I would say no, because right now intermediate carriers do not have to complete these reports. The FCC has a further notice of proposed rulemaking out looking at what kind of requirements they should have for intermediate carriers, such as least call routers.
Okay, so the answer is right now, no.
Yeah, to my understanding, yeah, that's correct.
By the way, I should correct myself. I said 1,000 subscribers. It should be 100,000 subscribers when I asked that question. So thanks for the correction from the person who submitted the question. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Lots of questions. I'm trying to get to as many as I can. This is somewhat related to the previous question, but a little bit different. Are any exclusions of reporting allowed? Can a provider offload reporting to an IXC or an LCR carrier? So can I outsource? If I need the report, can I outsource it to somebody else?
My response to that would be yes. It can be outsourced. There's a requirement that the person that's preparing the report has the FCC registration number, and to the extent that they've been identified as being the agent for the service provider, there's no reason that the particular report couldn't be outsourced.
Okay. Ryan or Andy, anything to add to that?
No.
Nope.
No. Okay. I think, Ken, you touched on this, but let's ask, the question was asked, so let's get it out there. When will the FCC define rural versus non-rural ILECS?
Yeah, that has been defined, and as I said, the list of rural versus non-rural ILECS is available on the NECA website, and each year it will be updated in the fourth quarter. But you can go on the NECA website, and there is just follow the links that get you to the page that has, it's basically a spreadsheet that will allow you to see the classification of rural versus non-rural. It's readily available.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Ken. All right, and I think, yeah, looks like we've worked our way through just about all of the questions, and it's just a few minutes before 3 o'clock. So I think we'll call it a day with regard to this particular topic. Let me just remind, first of all, let me first thank Andy and Ken and Ryan for spending the last hour with us. We appreciate the time and effort you went into putting the materials together and the questions and answers period that you went through with us just now. So thank you very much. A reminder to everybody, at the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be presented with a brief survey. We ask that you please take just a few moments to respond to that. Let us know what you thought of today's webinar and perhaps suggest topics for future webinars. And then lastly, look for an email from us, from CCMI. Sometime before the end of the week, you'll be able to download the audio of the webinar and all of the material that you saw today. And again, we encourage you to refer to that and share it with colleagues. With that, I'm going to thank our presenters, and most importantly, thank everyone who dialed in to be with us for this past hour. We appreciate your time and attention and look forward to being with you on another CCMI webinar soon. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.